Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome once again to Shelf of Many Things, where I take a look at indie and small press tabletop role-playing games, supplements, and accessories. And as much as I'd love to cover something truly different and not OSR related, although I do love OSR, I'm back once again with a Rules Light White Box derived system. Why? Because, well, this one's author, James Spawn, has produced some solid stuff that I've been very interested in the past, so I thought I'd take a look. Barrel Rider Games' Untold Adventures Deluxe Edition is an OSR Rules Light RPG based on the Swords and Wizardry White Box system, which itself has become quite popular to base other systems on. This particular incarnation shares much in common with many other white box derived systems, including the theme and the basic core resolution mechanics, but also the very wording in many places throughout, because it's simply the white box with some new mechanics added here and there. However, it also includes a lot of those changes, those new mechanics, just to further streamline play and to make the system feel completely different in terms of feeling like you're playing an entirely new system. Indeed, some of those streamlining tweaks I've seen actually in other non-white box based OSR games, although the way that they're implemented in Untold Adventures seems pretty seamless. Honestly, I think it just goes to show one of the things that I often, maybe not often, but occasionally mention about house rules in general, and that is you should never hesitate to borrow a good idea, even if it's from another RPG entirely, so long as it makes sense for your game. And that's really one of the main reasons that I cover so much OSR stuff. There's only so many times that you can remake a game just as a basic clone, but some offerings out there, even when, or especially when, they use a common rule set as the base, do manage to go above and beyond and present a number of new ideas to incorporate or use as inspiration in any OSR game. But enough about scavenging bits of systems, let's actually take a look at Untold Adventures as it stands. This review will be based on the PDF due to there being no print-on-demand option available as of the time I'm recording this. This is supposedly going to change in the near future, so if that interests you and the system interests you, keep an eye out. The PDF itself weighs in at 116 pages with a classic dungeon crawl-inspired cover by Jim Wampler. Other interior art is by William McCausland, and I've actually seen a number of the images in other OSR-inspired games, so by now the style, harkening back to the late 70s and early 80s D&D art, is becoming pretty familiar. Interior layout is very simple in terms of being just a single-column block style with easily readable headings, sometimes broken by tables and bullet point lists. Basic in terms of layout, but effective and pretty easy to read, and what more can you ask for? There are 7 chapters, plus an appendix and a short adventure called Keep in the Wildlands. Now, a lot of the content is actually just a direct translation of Swords and Wizardry White Box, which I've gone over quite a few times by now, in various formats. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and concentrate on the major differences that really define Untold Adventures and give it its own flavor. Character creation is pretty rote in terms of rolling ability scores. It defaults to the 3d6 to the classic 6 ability scores of Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma that we've all come to know. There is a universal attribute bonus from the Swords and Wizardry White Box rules, with only a single point of bonus or penalty across the range of scores. This affects the standard test for the most part, although high intelligence in this particular one, in Untold Adventures, will actually give spellcasters an additional first-level spell, so that's a plus. Hit dice use various d6s no matter the class, and only one saving throw number is used. Untold Adventures uses starting equipment packages to streamline character creation that I've seen in a number of both modern and OSR-style games by now, which is something I actually don't mind because it lets you make a character and get right into play rather than boggling over shopping for a while. Where Untold Adventures really departs from the standard Swords and Wizardry derived systems, however, is that there are only 2 classes rather than the 3 or 4 core classes that a fantasy gamer may be used to. The first class is the Swordsman, which is analogous to the Fighter of other systems, and their special ability is that they're the only ones that get an attack bonus that varies based on level. They also get very old school additional attacks against opponents with 1 or fewer hit dice, in terms of 1 additional attack per level, which you've seen going back all the way to the original D&D. Wizards and clerics, by contrast, have been unified into a simple spellcaster class. Now, spellcasters get to cast spells from spellbooks similar to a wizard in other games. The spell lists, however, include both cleric and wizard spells combined into one. More on that later, though. Spellcasters can wear armor and use shields, but doing so grants their targets a bonus to save versus their spells, and that can be completely avoided if a spellcaster concentrates on spells with no saving throws, such as buffs or heals or summons. Races include the human, the dwarf, the elf, and the halfling, which seem to actually be slightly more developed than you'd see in other rules-light systems, but not so much that they're unwieldy, and all of the bonus and penalties are in line with what you'd see in other OSR games in general. The non-human races are limited by class, with halflings and dwarves being limited to swordsmen, while elves are limited to spellcaster. Their levels are also capped a little bit under the maximum, but the limits are high enough, and the overall game is really geared towards level 10 and below, so it may not be that much of an issue. Adventuring gear is another area where Untold Adventures diverges from a lot of swords and wizardry-derived games. Rather than enumerating a bunch of specific gear for each character and the weight they're in, characters usually only have a few specific items, generally generated either by their class or by their race, but they also have something called adventuring gear rating, and that's just an abstract number, so if a challenge comes up that requires some adventuring gear that isn't one of the handful of specific items the party has at their disposal, someone in the party can just spend some adventuring gear rating and effectively pull it out of hammer space. Just boom, here's your rope. Boom, here's your pythons. And so forth. Then between adventures, then gold may be spent to buy back the adventuring gear rating to its normal rate. This does speed the game dramatically and makes for a lot less micromanagement. I feel that it's a bit of a trade-off though, since players no longer have to plan their character's loadout nearly as closely. A lot of tables may find this trade-off well worth it though, just in terms of the time spent. Weapons and armor are similarly streamlined, with weapons simply having a damage die based on their size, and armor simply being medium, light, or heavy, with no real distinction of types beyond that. Again, some tables will find this drastically simplifies play, and allows players to differentiate their characters through narration rather than mechanics. Ranged weapons don't usually track ammunition, which follows some other simplified game systems' lead, although there is an optional rule that will allow ammo to run out when a player rolls a natural 1 on an attack. Gameplay proceeds similarly to other swords and wizardry style systems aside from that, with the D20 style attack rolls versus AC either ascending or descending depending on the GM's choice. If you played any white box game at all, swords and wizardry or not, the basic adventuring rules should be well familiar to you by now. There's a bit of a difference with experience in terms of how it's handled and how it's awarded. Experience is gained from monsters and treasure, but not when the treasure is received. Rather, characters have to actually take it back to town and spend the treasure on something in order to get experience for it, whether that be spending it on ale and parties or on strongholds and gear. As for magic, there's 5 levels of magical spells, with the wizard and cleric spell lists from other swords and wizardry style systems combined into one list, which means the spellcaster can learn healing and attack spells both if they wish. Certain other things, such as the cleric's classical turn undead ability, have been rendered into spells that can be learned and cast, rather than used directly. Other than that, again, the spells are very straightforward. Most just have the name and the spell level with a range and duration, and maybe a paragraph or so of descriptive text. Pretty standard for most OSR games. The chapter on running the game seems to echo similar chapters from other OSR games, with hints and tips for designing adventures as well as for some optional resolution mechanics that tend to take the place of more complex skill systems that you'd see in other games. The monster list is pretty standard for pretty much any swords and wizardry based game, and the stats are in a similar style and range, with each monster having an AC in both descending and ascending systems, hit dice which are always d6s, number of attacks, which deal 1d6 unless otherwise mentioned, any special attacks they may have, and a general movement rate, although movement rates in Untold Adventures are abstracted out to either fast, standard, or slow rather than numerics, basically relative to what a standard human would run at. They do also have a hit dice equivalent listed for monsters rather than a particular experience list. There's also a few paragraphs of description as well for most monsters, as I mentioned. Interestingly enough, back to the experience part, experience for monsters seems to be a little bit more ad hoc in this system from what I can make out, rather than having just static experience. You've got to base it on the challenge involved with a particular monster. And because of that, the treasure system, while similar to some Swords and Wizardry based games, is based on the hit die equivalent rather than actual XP calculations. So it uses the HDE for a basis for the size of the treasure to allot for a particular monster. Other than that, Untold Adventures does retain the trade-off system from Swords and Wizardry and Swords and Wizardry White Box that lets the GM cash in portions of a treasure's cash value for gemstones and magical items, at least when designing particular hoards. The magic item list itself is at once somewhat simplified from other Swords and Wizardry based systems, but also expanded in other areas, which means that it's, got most of the tables offering only perhaps 6 or 7 options. It does help to keep the system relatively smooth to run when you do it like that, and it does offer a decent amount of variety in magic loot without going overboard. I will say that the miscellaneous magic list actually seems a little longer than what I'm used to seeing in a simplified OSR system. So you'd actually see almost as much in terms of miscellaneous magic in there as you'd see in a more complete rule system. Now, the first appendix does offer a number of character types, which are basically specializations that are tacked on to one of the 2 main classes in order to mimic the ability of more advanced classes in other systems. Each has a benefit and a restriction trade-off. For instance, a bard allows you to perform to secure your lodging or your lodging for your entire group, but then it precludes the use of shields, while an illusionist allows the use of a phantasmal force spell once per day for free, but then the spellcaster can't actually learn the turn undead spell. There's a fair number of these, and some are limited to specific non-human races. Then there's a few optional non-human races as well, which kind of mimic races from other games. The Abyssal-born, for instance, mimics the Tiefling, and then there's Dark Elves, Gnomes, Half-Orcs, etc. Each is on par with the core 4 races listed above, and I see very little in terms of imbalance as far as their overall abilities. There's a number of other rules, from mounts to sea travel to strongholds, firearms, etc. All of them are considered optional rules in the appendix and given a very brief mention. The book closes out with a brief location-based adventure, Keep in the Wildlands, that just offers a keyed monster-infested keep to clear. Now, it's pretty straightforward, but it does give a good indication of the minimalist style of design that this book would appeal to. Overall, the writing is nice enough, the rules are easy to read and understand, the simplifications, where they occur, fit very well and do a very good job of streamlining play. It's on par with other really rules-light systems in terms of the quick play design, while preserving that Swords and Wizardry OSR D&D style feel. A number of other simplified systems, however, do seem designed to shift more of the narrative burden to the players rather than the GM, and this system, it does that, but not to the same extent, which I personally think is a good thing. But it may not agree with everyone's sensibilities if they're used to having the players have way more control over the narration than the GM. As for someone who I'm going to recommend the game for, or whether I'd recommend it at all, I'm kind of torn actually. The system itself I think is very good, but it seems to be for a very thin slice of gamers. It occupies a sort of half step between, say, Swords and Wizardry White Box or other systems like White Box Medieval Adventures or something, and something like Swords and Wizardry Continual Light that completely scales things back to the bare bones. If you're looking for a middle range thing, then this may go ahead and be what you're looking for. I will say that it's easy to run and understand, even with the existing changes, so if your group is already playing something like White Box and is looking to streamline things a little bit further, but still have that same feel of a proper full-on role-playing long-term system, I'd say go ahead and pick it up and try it out. I'd also be willing to bet that the simplified gear system may be useful to some groups in general to pull out and plug directly into a more complex game. You know, even if you're using most of the other Swords and Wizardry things in a proper Swords and Wizardry game, the simplified gear system may smooth things along in terms of designing characters and getting them rolling really quickly. Just because I know that encumbrance and gear management is a bane for some groups. I know mine, I am a stickler for them in my games, but I know my players kind of hate that sometimes. And I think with that said, I'll leave it at that. I'll put the link where you can check this one out on RPG Now in the description below. This has been the RPG Crawler with Shelf of Many Things Untold Adventures Deluxe Edition. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got any feedback, and subscribe for more content, both tabletop and computer. If you're feeling particularly generous, I do have a Patreon at patreon.com/rpgcrawler that goes towards supporting this channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.